Welcome to the magical, the mystical, the ancient Aegean world. We are heading to discover the ancient Aegean civilizations of the Grecian islands, and we are looking mainly at the Cycladic Islands. We will also look at the ancient Minoan and Mycenaean cultures. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Devon, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Devon, and this is Art Trippin. Welcome to the ancient Aegean. The Aegean is a sea around the Cycladic Islands in modern-day Greece. We will look at three cultures in this introduction. First, we will look at the ancient prehistoric Cycladic cultures. Now, when we're talking about the Cycladic Islands, the Cyclades are these little tiny islands sort of in between modern-day mainland Greece, modern-day Turkey, and to the south, the island of Crete. So this kind of group of islands here, sort of in between the Aegean, the Mediterranean, and the Sea of Crete. These are the Cycladic Islands. This is a really ancient culture that we don't know that much about, but we have found objects in their grave sites. So we will look at depictions of the human form. These sculptures are carved out of marble, and they're very geometric, very abstract depictions of the human form. Then we will look at the Minoans. And in fact, if you love the Minoans, check out the next video on the ancient Minoan snake goddess. And when we look at the Minoans, we will talk about their breezy depictions of nature, sport, and daily life for the Minoan people. We will also look at this idea of the Minoan culture being led by women. Perhaps women were in charge here. And we don't see a lot of militaristic imagery from this culture. But we do see militaristic imagery from the Mycenaeans. We will study the architectural innovations of the Mycenaean citadels, and we will look at their depictions of military and of rulership. Let's first look at prehistoric Cycladic culture. When we look at art from this time period, we're talking about these Cycladic islands, the islands in the Aegean Sea. And in terms of time period, we're talking roughly 3300 to 2000 BCE, also known as a long-ass time ago. The ancient Cycladic people were counted sort of among the three major Aegean cultures, that is the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Mycenaeans. Cycladic marble figurines of abstract male and female forms have been found at burial sites. These figures vary in size. Some are small, some are larger, up to 2 or even 3 feet, and they rely on geometric shapes for their design. And scholars believe that these likely were painted originally. There are traces of paint on some of these. When we look at the figures, we see a pretty clear gender difference, or at least this is how we've interpreted it in modern times. We see female figurines depicting a woman with her legs together and her arms folded over her abdomen, and we see an emphasis on the breasts and the pubic region through sort of modeling. So there are kind of modeled breasts and usually a triangle in the pubic region. So there seems to be some emphasis on fertility, perhaps. Definitely some kind of indication of biological sex here. Then, when we look at the male figures, they almost always are depicted seated. So they're sitting in a chair, and they're often playing a harp or a lyre, playing a musical instrument. We don't know who created these. We don't have any names of artists. In fact, we don't have any writing yet at this point in ancient Aegean history. But we do see these figures that are very geometric. You can see that the body is almost comprised of these triangles and cylinders. The woman has her arms across her stomach, which is pretty typical. Almost all of these sculptures have this exact same pose. And because of this, because of the emphasis on the pubic region and the breasts and the arms across the belly, many scholars have interpreted these as having something to do with women's fertility, that they are somehow symbolic of fertility. We don't know this for sure, but this could be one of the meanings of these images. These date to around the same time as the ancient Egyptian pyramids, and they are made of marble because there was an abundance of marble on the Cycladic Islands. Here we really see the human form has been reduced to these very basic geometric shapes, and perhaps because of this emphasis on the breast, the belly, and the pubic region, this image may remind us of some of the ancient prehistoric images like the woman of Willendorf. If you look at them closely, you can see that they don't actually stand on their own. The feet are too small and fragile to really support the rest of the sculpture, so they couldn't stand up. In fact, when you see them in the museum, they're sort of affixed to a wall or hanging on something because they can't stand on their own. So this makes us think that maybe these were meant to lie down. And in fact, they were often found in grave sites. However, many of these have come to the art market through the black market, so that means they have been removed from the archaeological record, not actually found in the grave sites. They've just sort of appeared magically. But the few that we have found in the archaeological record are coming directly from grave sites, so this makes us think that perhaps they're meant to lie down. The other possibility is that they're meant to be carried in a procession and then laid down in the grave, perhaps. So we think that they might be some kind of object related to funerary rituals. But beyond that, we don't know that much about these objects. Some scholars believe that they are representative of some kind of great goddess of nature in a kind of continuous tradition of that Neolithic female figure and the Paleolithic female figure, that image of the woman of Willendorf. Some other archaeologists would disagree, but this is just one interpretation. They have been variously interpreted as idols of the gods, depictions of some kind of deity or goddess, perhaps images related to death, and some scholars even think they might be something as simple as a children's doll. Most scholars agree that they're probably more than dolls, but perhaps less than sacrosanct idols. What do you think? Let me know in the comments what you think about these. Moving on, let's look at some images of the male lyre player. Here you can see the male forms are commonly engaged in some kind of activity, usually making music. This is a common theme. And the female figures seem to function solely as these fertility images. These sculptures of the male figures are meant to sit on their own. They don't really need any propping up. There is, again, some evidence that they were painted. They might have been wearing garments and jewelry. To us today, they look very remote and very abstract because they're this smooth white marble. And in fact, these Cycladic sculptures kind of exploded onto the art collecting scene in the last 50 to 75 years. And because these are so popular in the contemporary era, this has sort of encouraged plundering of these Cycladic grave sites, unfortunately. So we have lost some of the original historical context because of this smooth white marble and this abstracted design that creates almost a modern aesthetic. People seem to be attracted to this very simplified, geometric, bold look. It's almost sort of minimalist and modern. And so because of this kind of rage and craze in the 1900s, many of these objects have entered the art market through plunder. And why do we care about that? Because basically this means that we don't know the original historical context. We do know that some have been found in graves, but others might have been found in other places, and we don't really understand that whole context because we've lost the archaeological record. Let's move over to the island of Crete and talk about the ancient Minoan civilization. Crete really was the center of Europe's first truly advanced civilization, the ancient Minoans. They're dated to about 2700 to 1420 BCE. And this civilization wrote in an undeciphered script known as Linear A. So if anybody out there wants to nerd out, maybe you can decipher their writing. They do have two scripts, one that we can read and one that we can't yet read. Now, let's go to this island of Crete. You can see this is a really large island at sort of the southern end of the Cycladic region of the Cycladic Islands. When we look to early Cretan history, we see that it is replete with legends, such as those of King Minos, Theseus, and the Minotaur, passed on orally via poets such as Homer. Not that Homer. Not Homer Simpson. It is believed that the volcanic eruption of nearby Thira, this is modern day Santorini, devastated, or at least contributed to the devastation of the Minoan civilization. So there was a huge volcanic eruption. The sky was covered in ash for like a year. All of the crops died. None of the crops could grow. And on top of that, the ancient Mycenaeans came in and invaded the ancient Minoan civilization. So what do we need to know about the Minoans? The Minoan culture thrived on the modern Greek island of Crete, and the city is known as Knossos. You might see it called the Palace of Knossos, but really it's more like a city itself. It's not just a residence for the elite, but there are thriving and bustling markets, businesses. It's really more like a city, even though it was excavated by Sir Robert Evans, who called it a palace. And in fact, British archaeologist Sir Robert Evans is the one who named the culture the Minoans after King Minos of the famous story of the Minotaur. This is probably a misnomer. I mean, obviously, the Minotaur is a story from mythology, but Sir Robert Evans, as he was excavating this place, he said, "Oh my gosh, this looks like a labyrinth. I think I found the labyrinth of King Minos. This is where King Minos would have kept the Minotaur." And then, of course, eventually, Theseus comes, and with the help of Ariadne, let's not write her out of the history, with the help of Ariadne, Theseus was able to slay the Minotaur, follow the yarn that Ariadne had given him to exit out of the maze, free himself from the labyrinth, and then return to Athens. On his way back to Athens, as we know, he abandoned Ariadne on the island of Naxos. And you can visit the island of Naxos even today if you want to go soak in some of that Ariadne energy. Yes, Ariadne did marry the god Dionysus, the god of wine, on the island of Naxos. Now, let's get back to Crete. Who's King Minos? King Minos is a child of the god Zeus and a mortal woman named Europa, and he was given the ability to rule from Poseidon, the god of the sea. However, King Minos angered Poseidon, and Poseidon punishes King Minos by making his wife fall in love with a bull. Just Greek deities doing Greek deity things. So they coupled, and the result was a Minotaur, half man and half bull. The Minotaur terrorizes the palace of King Minos, which is described as labyrinth-like. And supposedly this Minotaur was kept in this labyrinth underground, and every year demanded an offering. So every month, the Athenians had to send someone to be sacrificed to the Minotaur on the island of Crete. Eventually, the bull was ultimately slayed by the Athenian hero Theseus, although Theseus had help from Ariadne. Let's not forget it. So here we see depicted on later Greek pottery, what we consider sort of classical Greek pottery. We can see depictions of Theseus slaying the Minotaur. Sometimes you will also see Ariadne there. She gave him a ball of yarn so that he could find his way out of the labyrinth. So, according to the archaeologists who excavated this site, Knossos, This place was the site of King Minos, his labyrinth, and his Minotaur. Most archaeologists today agree that this is likely not the case. But what is the case? What do we find at this ancient Minoan city? We find a great deal of absolutely stunning Minoan painting. The Minoan painting style is characterized by really curvilinear, fluid figures that create a sense of dynamic movement. The figures all have a very snatched waist, a pinched in waist. We see lots of S-shaped forms in their bodies. Often the shoulders are depicted frontally, but then their bodies are depicted in profile, so a sort of composite perspective. And depending on which scholar you ask, in general, the genders of the figures are generally recognizable by the shade of their skin or their clothing. Men were known to have darker complexion, or they wore short skirts, and women typically had lighter complexions and they wore long floor-length skirts with an open top. That's right, their titties were out. I think I was an ancient Minoan in another lifetime because this outfit, this way of dressing, I love it. The overall mood of Minoan art tends to be sort of cheerful and light. We see lots of inspiration from nature. We see surreal landscapes inspired by a really peaceful life on the island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. We see in Minoan art lots of depictions of women, so much so that some scholars think there may have been one particular woman or a group of women in charge of this civilization, that perhaps this was some kind of matrilineal culture where women held power and esteem. We see such a great prevalence of female iconography that some scholars believed this culture was ruled by women. At least women had some kind of status and power. And this is kind of unprecedented in the ancient world in Western Europe. We don't see this again until the ancient Etruscans on mainland Italy. The ancient Greeks, we would not call them feminists. Women here at Knossos had access to all professions, including manufacturing of their famous pottery, which was traded with other existing cultures at the time. And we know this because we have found Minoan pottery in ancient Egyptian tombs. So this means that the Minoans were known all around the Mediterranean world for their chef's kiss amazing pottery. Speaking of that pottery, here you can see some depictions of Minoan pottery. This is the very famous octopus vase. We can also see Minoan ceramics. Here is our friend, the snake goddess, which if you want to know more about the Minoan snake goddess, stay tuned for our next video when I dive deep into the depictions of the Minoan snake goddess and female imagery in general in ancient Minoan art. We see really dynamic wall paintings. Here we're looking at the dolphin mural from the so-called Queen's bathroom, and you can see that there is a playfulness, a kind of joy and exuberance in Minoan wall art. Here we can see an almost like Dr. Seuss-like landscape. This is from a Minoan site on the island of Thira, or modern-day Santorini, and you can see these curving, undulating lines, really sinuous, graceful forms, and a very bright, playful color palette. Here we're looking at a reconstruction of Knossos. This was really more of a city than a palace. It's not just homes, but also marketplaces, plazas, and scholars speculate that around 50 to 80,000 people were living here and in the surrounding countryside. It does appear that the wealthier members of society had villas out in the countryside around the city center. People lived a very free life here. There's no evidence of really fortified walls, so people aren't protecting themselves from some kind of outside military influence, which might have been part of their downfall, unfortunately. But they lived a very peaceful life. Life was very connected to the sea. We see depictions of sea life in their pottery, in their wall paintings, in all areas of their artistic production. In fact, the interior walls of these buildings would have really been covered with figurative imagery. This city itself was quite advanced for for the time. The Minoans had two written languages. One we have deciphered, and it's used for making inventories. The other one is yet to be ciphered, and we speculate that this might be the very poetic language, perhaps the language of spirituality, of music, and of art. At the time, Knossos was the largest structure in Europe. The Minoans had paved roads and running water 1,000 years before the ancient Romans. So I know if you're a fan of the ancient Romans, you gotta check out the Minoans. They had terracotta pipes that flushed waste out to the sea. I mean, like literally an Englishman from the 1800s would have his mind blown. We do have evidence of extensive sea trade and the building of communal civic centers here on the island of Crete. However, by 1700 BCE, the palaces of the island were destroyed and life on the island was significantly disrupted. We don't know exactly why, but most scholars agree that there was a cataclysmic event, a volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thira or Santorini, and this paired with an invasion by the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans are those who took over and eventually sort of birthed what we think of as the true ancient Greek civilization. So let's talk about the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaean culture rejects the delicacy of Minoan art in favor of a more sturdy and realistic depiction of the world. In fact, we see some really striking portraiture, and this portraiture is aimed at capturing the actual likeness of a person, and we can see that here in this beaten gold funerary mask. We will also see when we look at ancient Mycenaean art and architecture that they used architecture to imply a sense of strength and power, that their cities were fortified with big stone walls that are meant to appear impenetrable. Here we're looking at the Lion's Gate. This is the sort of entrance into a city, and you can see this figure of the lion, often associated with rulership and kingship in the ancient world, depicted over this really strong stone wall at this entrance to the city. The gate was built for defensive purposes, but it also reflected this idea of the lion as the protector, the lion as this symbol of kingship, rulership, strength, and power. And just to give you a sense of scale, the lions here are 9 feet tall. So this is really massive type of art and architecture. Here we're entering into the treasury of Atreus. This is often referred to as the tomb of Agamemnon. And here we're looking at the funerary mask, a gold death mask. This kind of mask was commonly found placed over the face of the wealthy deceased. And we get here some sense of what this man might have looked like. We get some of the nuance of his mouth, his little mustache that curls up on the end, his eyes. Here we are looking at an image of hunters, this hunter capturing a bull. This is also made of gold, found near Sparta, Greece, dated to about 1500 BCE. And the sort of hunting and the chasing of the bull is often read as a metaphor for warfare. But we also see very specific, very obvious depictions of warfare and of soldiers in ancient Mycenaean art. Here we're looking at the warrior's vase, dated to 1200 BCE. And here you can clearly see a depiction of Mycenaean soldiers going off to battle. They were known as militaristically powerful. Hopefully this has been an informative introduction to ancient Aegean art. Sound off in the comments below. What do you think were the possible functions of those marble Cycladic sculptures? And what do you think about Minoan art? What was the focus of their art? Did they emphasize the afterlife? And what about ancient Mycenaean art? Do you like this idea of expressing strength and power and military might through art and architecture? Let me know in the comments what you think about this introduction to ancient Aegean art. As always, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this has been Art Trippin, the lecture series. By the way, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for more Art Trippin, the lecture series.